From the first motor car that Mr. Ford made in 1896, the pages of our scrapbook trace the development of the early Ford cars. The introduction of the Model T saw the opening in 1909 of the Ford Motor Company of Detroit in Great Britain, with premises at Brook Green, London, and in 1911 the registration of the Ford Motor Company, England, Limited. Another famous T. Teddy Roosevelt was making history in his own way by his safari into the depths of Africa. These early pictures were some of the first newsreels ever taken. By October of that year, the first Ford Works was opened at Trafford Park, Manchester, to assemble the cars that were imported from America. A warehouse was converted, and the first British-assembled Model T was completed. The first of a car that was to remain in production until 1927. Yes, 1911 was the start of a new era. This was the year of the coronation of King George V and Queen Mary, a year when the world came to Britain and all seemed set for peace and prosperity. And prosperity there was in plenty. The gay social round had the ladies competing with one another in their latest creations. And what creations they were. If you hadn't got a poodle, a Pekingese would do. As long as the photographer was around. This gaiety was, however, short-lived, and the struggle for notoriety gave way to the struggle for survival. The 1914-18 war, and Ford became a major producer of equipment for the armed services. The years that followed the war saw rapid strides in the output of vehicles. There seemed no end to the use of the motor car. If you didn't want to ride in one, well, you could dance on it. It had become clear that a new factory would be required to keep pace with the ever-growing demand. But where? That was the problem. To the marshy shores of Essex and the banks of the Thames, Ford finally came. Build a factory on marshland, it didn't seem possible. But the warnings were a challenge to be met, and the Ford Motor Company acquired the site. In 1925, a milestone was reached. The 250,000th Model T to be produced at Manchester was completed, and this car went on a 3,600-mile tour of Britain. 1927 saw the last of this famous line of cars in production. Since their first introduction in America, 15 million had been built. The same year saw the introduction of the Model A, a 24-horsepower model. In those days, as today, the toughness and reliability of Ford cars was the key to their success. Here's a Model A climbing Ben Nevis, the year 1928. '29 saw the cutting of the first turf at Dagenham by Mr. Edsel Ford. The young Henry Ford II watches his father from behind the speaker's desk. Enterprise was not lacking in other spheres. This was the year the Graf Zeppelin made her round-the-world flight. And New York greeted her with traditional welcome. Commander Byrd made his epic polar flight. These were the events that made the headlines in 1929. Here was real progress and a tribute to man's enterprise. Yes, enterprise was in the air, and in the air over the Essex marshland, a new sound to vie with the cry of the birds. The great venture had begun. While in London, the company acquired showrooms in Regent Street. The following year, in 1931, the factory had been completed and ready for use. So as not to hold up production, the move from Manchester was made over the weekend. By rail and road, the great exodus was on, and by Tuesday, vehicles were in production at Dagenham. And on the 2nd of November 1931, the first vehicle rolled off the production line. At the wheel, Mr. A.R. Smith, now Sir Rowland Smith. Even from the early days in Manchester, the Ford pioneered system of flow production had been operating, a system whereby a regulated flow of components is maintained through every manufacturing process. With the facilities afforded by the new factory, production was stepped up on existing models while the designers were busy with yet another Ford car. The following year, in 1932, this car was introduced. An 8-horsepower car. The day of the small car had arrived. It was a step forward in the history of the motor car. This was the year that the Sydney Harbour Bridge was opened. Do you remember the drama when an officer on horseback interrupted the ceremony by declaring the bridge open and slashing at the tape with his sword? He was arrested and escorted from the hostile crowd. As soon as order had been restored, the official opening was carried out, and the first ship steamed beneath the mighty bridge. Remember the world's heaviest champion? Yes, Primo Carnera, who had one of the shortest reigns as champion, from June 1933 to June 1934. And 1934 was the year that saw the introduction of the C, a deluxe 10-horsepower car. It was 1935 that the Popular was announced. It was a two-door car and the price £100. The cheapest car ever to be produced. The car that was to bring motoring within the reach of millions. Here at last was the means to get away from it all, even if some people had their own ideas about getting away from it all. Meanwhile, in America, a 6-year-old girl was the biggest box office draw in the cinema, Shirley Temple. 1935 was a year for the small people. It's now 1937 and a new model, the 7Y. To be followed in the same year by the 7W, a deluxe 10-horsepower car. 1938 and more records were being broken. The Queen Mary arrived in New York, the winner of the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic. The same year saw the launching of her sister ship by the Queen and bearing her name. And 1938 saw the launching of another new model by Ford of Dagenham, the Prefect, the first of the series to bear this name. By the next year, another famous name was to appear, the Anglia, an 8-horsepower car. But this was destined to be the last model for some years. The storm clouds that had been gathering over Europe finally broke. His Majesty George VI conferred with the Prime Minister, and to the country came the call to arms. And to Dagenham came the call for equipment, urgent supplies that would be needed for the struggle. During the long and dangerous days that lay ahead, production continued unceasingly. Throughout the entire period of the war, production was never seriously held up. New faces replaced the old as workers left to fight on other fronts. At the Shadow Factory at Manchester, Ford achieved the seemingly impossible task of mass-producing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, which were to power the Spitfires, Mosquitoes, and Lancasters of the Royal Air Force. By 1944, Ford of Dagenham had produced 100,000 wheeled war vehicles and 95% of all war tractors. The men who had made the Prefect in Anglia now found themselves building or driving vehicles of a very different sort. In England, the victory celebration marked the end of hostilities. The long years of war had seen many changes. Changes, too, in America. With the death of Mr. Edsel Ford and the retirement of his Henry Ford II had returned from active service to become president of the Ford Company. Meanwhile, at Dagenham, production was restarted on the Anglia. It was obvious that the post-war era would produce great changes in car design, and the 1949 Prefect, with its new front-end treatment, was an indication of the shape of things to come. The following year saw the first of the new style cars, the Consul. Although not in the small car class, it was the forerunner of the new conception and body design. Together with its six-cylinder counterpart, the Zephyr 6, a notable stride forward was made in the history of Ford. The next landmark was the year 1953, with Professor Pickard making a record descent of 2.5 miles in his bathyscope off the Italian coast. A record, too, for Dagenham, with the production of its 2 millionth car, a Zephyr 6. A car which the same year won the Monte Carlo Rally outright. The new styling features which had been so successfully launched with these cars was extended to the small car range, and the first of the new style Anglias emerged. A compact two-door car which has achieved outstanding success on the home market and overseas, together with its four-door counterpart, the Prefect. Yes, 1953 was a year of achievement, a year when more than 1/5 of all vehicles and tractors exported from Britain were Ford products. The development of Dagenham in the post-war years has been impressive. During 1946, the first full year of peace, the output was 91,000 units, a figure which was to grow with the years to an all-time record of 417,000, of which 216,000 were sent abroad. Since the war, Dagenham has seen a great expansion program launched. Costing some £65 million, this project is designed to keep pace with the ever-increasing demand for the company's products. This giant new assembly building is part of the program to increase production of vehicles at Dagenham to more than 2,000 units a day. New buildings and machinery and additional facilities have increased the ground area of Ford in England by more than 8 times. An entirely new and modern foundry has been erected, embodying all the latest principles of automation, ensuring high precision, quality, and clean, hygienic working conditions. And throughout it all, the designers are busy at work planning the new cars that will follow the models already pouring from the factory. Just over 30 years have elapsed since the last Model T was made. Years that have seen vast changes in the development of the motor car. And what of the future? Today, a new form of transport makes its appearance, the flying saucer, giving us yet another glimpse into the future and opening the gateway to a new and revolutionary form of travel. As man seeks new fields of exploration and conquest, a new era of travel will emerge. Around the world in 80 minutes will open up new possibilities in the urge to get away from it all. Leaving behind a new generation to discover the joys of motoring. Today, with the introduction of the completely new Anglia, Ford maintained the great traditions of the past. July 1959. The London Hippodrome saw a worldwide audience of Ford executives gathered for a spectacular presentation of this new model. It is fitting that the last page in our scrapbook should be the introduction of this completely new Anglia, a car which truly lives up to its claim as the world's most exciting light car.